No, I have a whole new crowd. Wow, that's fantastic. Well, the handouts that you have, I changed the presentation up a little bit. So the second half of it, I don't have those slides in there, but they are available online if you go and look at our cleanup criteria website. So it's on the DEQ website, and that presentation is available if you want to see those. I have some conceptual site models there that you can look at. But I wanted to give you more of an update because things have changed, things are progressing, and I know everyone has the one burning question: when are we going to have criteria? When will the new criteria be promulgated? Well, I'm not quite sure. I'm going to be honest. We're working on it, and we are working with stakeholders on it because they're complicated. Now, we have 67,000 inputs for the cleanup criteria for 305 different hazardous substances. And we have 116 equations. We have 8 pathways, and then 1 QA/QC process, or a partridge in a pear tree. So since they are that complicated, and this was a major overhaul because we have not updated the criteria since 2002, this is a very complicated process because things have changed. But this is why we have cleanup criteria. You know, this is Michigan, a place where we like to, live and work and play. And this is the Michigan that we like. And the DEQ's mission is to create a future for Michigan where the risks posed by contaminated properties are reliably managed, properties are productively redeveloped, and our environment is protected. This is why we have the criteria. So we have 2 different kinds of criteria. We have the generic, which is what I'll be talking about today. And generic are meant to just be applied across the board to most sites. And then you have site-specific. And that's where you start looking at the equations and looking at the different exposure assumptions, different toxicological information about the chemicals and their physical properties. So we have site-specific. And those you do, and you can work with our staff, and they aren't affected by these rules other than the algorithms that you use. So here's a bit of a history of where we've been in Michigan. Starting in 1982, Act 307 was part of the environmental movement. And at that point in time, our goal was clean it up. You spilled it, clean it up. We want it to be non-detect or to background levels. And then in 1990, we had the rules, where we started looking at that and saying, well, you can't necessarily clean everything up. So we had type A, B, and C. So type A, we still had clean it up, remove the contamination to non-detect or background. Or else we had a type B, which was associated with a residential closure. Those properties could be used for residential purposes. So we're starting to look at risks. And then type C, site-specific. In 95, so when Part 201 came into being. Act 307 was rescinded, and we had 201. But it took us until 2002 to promulgate the rules that have the cleanup criteria. And those cleanup criteria, it took about 7 years to develop them. Because, like I said, it's complicated. 67,000 inputs, 8 different pathways. And we didn't even have that many pathways back in 2002. We have vapor intrusion. That's something new that we didn't have back then. And then in 2010, the legislature recognized that there's advances in science. And these numbers have not been reviewed, looked at, updated in, at that time, 8 years. And there's more that we know about them. So they wanted us to take a look at the criteria, determine whether we needed an update, and then proceed with an update. So we did that, and yeah, we decided that yes, there were enough advances, there's enough new information, and we want to make sure that the cleanup criteria are protective of public health and the environment based upon what we know. And it's been a process that we've been going through. So in 2013, that was our deadline that the legislature gave us, told us that we had to have that done. So we were not quite there, we were not ready. We're still trying to work through a process of updating, how to update the criteria. And what we found was, since we weren't ready, we just repromulgated what we had. And then we started with a stakeholder group, the Criteria Stakeholders Advisory Group. Followed that. And we've been working with them. We worked with them for quite some time, and we developed a playbook. The playbook was how we're going to update these criteria, what we're going to look at, what sources will we use. And US EPA IRIS is something that we're using, and we're looking at a lot of other states and comparing what they're using. And so this playbook that was developed basically was an outline for how our staff were going to update the criteria. And they did that. And we published those in April. And then since then, we had public meetings that to roll out the criteria, to explain what was in it, what they were. And then we had our public hearing. We initially had the public hearing date set for July 13th, but we had an overwhelming response. Because this package is this thick, it takes a lot to go through it. So from April to July, it was hard to go through it, to allow people to comment on it, review the information, see how we did this. We're trying to do this in a transparent way. So we extended the date for the criteria public hearing to September 12th, with a public comment ending on the 13th. Well, we did that. We received numerous comments. People had time to go through there. They looked at how we generated the numbers. They looked at the process and provided us with comments. And initially, we came out with some significant revisions that we felt would make the criteria better. So we published those in October. And we then held a second public hearing on October 17th. Following that, we received additional comments, and we are now engaged with stakeholders working through these processes to address concerns. There's some concerns about process, there's some concerns about exposures, there's some concerns about some of the other items in there. So we are working to address those and meeting and committed to meeting with stakeholders. So at this point in time, we are anticipating, now it may shorten up, but our drop dead date is April 1st to have this package published with revisions to it to make sure that it is the best package that we can put out. Now, something could change, and that could be put out sooner. The package might be rolled out sooner, or I'm not sure if it would be delayed beyond that. But at this point in time, we're looking at April 1st, and then we will then have another public hearing opportunity with public comment. So we're going to keep using our processes. So this is what is affected by the cleanup criteria. This is our universe. This is just the leaking underground storage tank sites. Currently, our latest numbers are we have 8,100 releases. Our goal is to close these. We have been closing these, working with our risk-based processes. We have been closing, on average, between 300 and 400 sites a year. But then, you know how tank systems are. They still leak. So we get, approximately between 100 and 200 new releases a year. So, it's a constant process. But currently, 6,400 sites across the state are open and require some work before they get closure. And then here's the rest of the universe, which is 201 and Superfund, all the other contaminated sites. We have 6,300 of them that we are working on, and just 65 Superfund sites. There we go. And like I said, the criteria are being updated because they haven't been updated since 2002, which is a long time. Science advances. You know, look at our cell phones. You know, back in the 90s when we had Act 307, I got a pager and thought that was pretty slick. You know, they could locate me out in the field. And, you know, I get a page and, you know, I go find a phone and I call them. And then we all had Nextels, right? Chirp, 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 chirp. You know, that was really cool. Walkie-talkie, talking to each other. And now we've got phones that, you know, tell us, you know, when to get up and tell us where we're going and tell us, you know, everything else. And you have the world at your fingertips. Well, things changed, you know, as far as our understanding of these chemicals like that. So this is why we are proceeding. So here's some of the big broad updates that we did to the criteria. The first thing we did was, if you look through the criteria that we currently have, their pieces are kind of strewn throughout. The criteria, things aren't grouped. So what we did was we reorganized and grouped items together that made sense to group them together. And we also developed a process for non-carcinogenic developmental and reproductive toxicants. That's something new. We didn't have that. So it makes sense that those kind of exposures, some of those chemicals, can really cause some damage. So we needed to look at the developmental and reproductive toxicants. We've added children to the equation. You know, we have children in Michigan. So it made sense to add children to the equation, as they are very sensitive receptors for some of these compounds. And so that they were added to, so it's an adult plus a child receptor when we are looking at exposures. Considerations we've given to now for mutagenic carcinogens in the early life stages. And then new vapor intrusion. Vapor intrusion is exploding across the nation. It's an emerging pathway, and there's a lot of concern, and we're learning a lot about it. So now we have new vapor intrusion rules and a whole tiered process. It's very different from anything that we've had before. So that means that the soil volatilization to indoor air and groundwater volatilization, civic and givic, those will go away. And we'll have new screening levels, and then the tiered process then allows you to put some site-specific inputs. So they're specific inputs that are relative to the site you're working on. They include, you know, you can look at the geology. So if you have sand, you put sand in there. If you have clay, you put clay into the equation. And we have developed a calculator for that. It's not yet available, but it will be available for ease of use when you are working on the vapor intrusion pathway. And then one of the mandates was that we use Michigan-specific data where we could. So we looked at soil temperatures. Our soil temperatures are very different than from a national average when you consider someplace like Arizona or Florida and North Dakota. We're different. So we put in our Michigan-specific numbers when we calculated criteria where we could. So again, the Criteria Stakeholders Advisory Group, their guiding principles were to look at chemical, physical, and toxicity data, pick the best available science, and that was put into the playbook. And we want our process to be transparent. So we have been engaged with stakeholders. We're trying to get out there. We're trying to tell you about what we're working on. And we're looking at our exposure assumptions, making sure that we're getting that right and that we're using Michigan-specific where we can. All with the goal that DEQ is tasked with to protect human health and the environment. So here's our exposure assumptions. Because we have to protect for our 8 different pathways, but they include inhalation type of exposures, include ingestion exposures, and thermal contact exposures. So our initial exposure duration was, I think, 30 years. Now it's 32 years for residential. And non-residential was 21 years in the current numbers, and now it's 20. Our averaging time, we are now living longer. The current is based on 70-year time frame. We're living now, our average life expectancy is 78 years. And the average body weight, we're getting a little heavier. That went up to 80. I think it was somewhere around 70 in the current ones. But, maybe we're just all building a little bit more muscle, Or maybe we should be. So what we did in generating the criteria is the first thing that we had to do was develop a health-based value. So we looked at used our exposure assumptions, then we looked at the different effects that a chemical can have, whether it's a carcinogen, it's a developmental toxicant, it's mutagen, it's a non-carcinogen. What effects does it have? And plugged that into the algorithms. And we selected then the lowest value because that would make it the most protective. Because again, you got to think of generic. They have to be protective for basically everything. So the value is lower. So we selected the lower value in the calculation of the health-based number. And then, once we had the health-based value, we compared that to other standards that were maybe available for that particular compound. So we have the health-based value that's then compared to a state drinking water standard, if we have it, or an aesthetic value, if we have that, its solubility level, and its target detection limit. Some things we still have a hard time analyzing, and we can't get down to the level that might be the health-based value. The method isn't there. The method isn't refined enough to get us down to see it at that level. So what we then do is we compare all of these, and we select the lowest value, and then that becomes the cleanup criteria. So, like I said, if you can't see it down to the health-based value, we would probably default right back to the target detection limit. Or if there's a state drinking water standard, that's what we would go to. So using all of that, then we come up with a generic cleanup criteria. And again, I talked about being transparent. We have now provided in the lookup tables, they look a little bit different. We have the basis for the inputs that we used. And we have the source. And so we have EPI, that's EpiSuite, EPA4 for the source, that's EPA sources, and we have footnotes in there. The basis, the EXP is for experimental, EST is estimated, so we would select something that would be experimental as far as there was testing done, there's some demonstrated documentation overestimated, but if there wasn't any experimental, then we would pick estimated. So all of that is laid out in the playbook for how to do this. But we put all of these here so that you know when you go there, you can see exactly where we selected the number from and got the input from. So again, I talked about our public comment period. and our commitment to working with stakeholders and working with practitioners who do this every day, because we want to have the best, most protective values for our citizens here in Michigan. And in working with that, I said we had 2 public hearings already. We will have a 3rd. And this gives you some perspective of what we have changed already. So this is what we changed after the September public hearing and the comments that we received. We updated some draft toxicity values. Those toxicity, some of them that we put in the criteria, we did not have values. The criteria were completed about a year ago. And since we did not have hard number values, we went through and reviewed, and some, they now have values. So we inputted the new numbers in for this and took out the draft where we could. They weren't all, so there are still some draft values in there, but where there were advances and we got some numbers, we used them. We revised the footnote for developmental toxicants. Formaldehyde was removed. It was considered a developmental toxicant and has been removed based on recent information. And our state drinking water standards and the aesthetic values, they had different significant digits, so we just matched, lined them up, aligned them with the same significant digits that we have for the criteria. So that was an easy one. And then a number of them relate to vapor intrusion. Like I said, vapor intrusion is huge. We did not have a non-residential exposure time frame for inhalation in the criteria. So we added a 12-hour inhalation time frame. And we have an assumption in the tiered process that groundwater is in contact with a building. We modified that assumption because groundwater isn't always in contact with a building, so we changed that. And our equations for finite soil inhalation criteria were modified. So since we modified those, that changes the finite criteria values for the 2 meters and the 5 meters. So that's a change, and it changed the number. So not only, do the revisions change some of the equations, it then changes the output and the number. And this is a significant pathway in that we are already seeing that we have several sites that are coming to our attention. We've estimated that we have about 4,000 sites where vapor intrusion could be a problem across the state. That's what we've identified so far. So we are asking for supplemental funding in RRD to boost our vapor intrusion program and help develop a program so that we can be more proactive with this, because we are also working with the Department of Health and Human Services, and we have already had 10 buildings or properties evacuated because of vapor issues. PCE and TCE, trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene, are major concerns, and we're finding them in areas where we've had some redevelopment. We closed sites back in the 90s when we weren't considering vapor intrusion, and now we're finding that we probably should be looking at that. So that's going to be big, and probably the next big thing that we'll be talking about after we finalize the criteria will be vapor intrusion and what we can do about it and how we can address it and all that good stuff. And we also issued an emergency rule. We found that 1,4-dioxane. We have information that it's more toxic than what we had known back in 2002. And our value was 85, and now it's 7.2. So with the issuance of the emergency rule, which is in effect for 6 months, it can be renewed. We're hoping that it's not, that it will just get rolled into the cleanup criteria package when we finally promulgate it.
But for now, we also added a residential vapor intrusion number too. So when you sample your groundwater, 29 parts per million is the level where you're gonna have to start looking at it a little bit harder for 1,4 dioxin. So here's our process. And as I said, we're hoping that after April 1st, we will have a package that everybody's comfortable in submitting. We'll host a public hearing, and we'll accept comments again. And we'll submit the final rules then to JCAR, the Joint Committee in the legislature. And they have 15 session days to say okay, or it just passes and we will have new rules. And they are anticipated to take immediate effect. So if you're working on a site now, I really highly recommend working with the district staff or section staff, if you're working on Superfund, to work with them and look at these values and see where you are on track with your site. We don't enforce these draft numbers, but it gives you some perspective of where we're headed with them. Because some numbers went up, some numbers went down, some stayed the same. And it can be that much variation for one compound, depending upon the pathway. So for drinking water, it may have gone down. For inhalation, it may have gone up. It may, or contact, it may go up. So they're all varied, so I can't tell you across the board how they've changed or were there any trends, because they are all over the place. So that gets us to implementation, into the weeds. And it's something that you really have to work with staff, and highly recommend that you contact staff, you tell them about your site, work with them on your site, so that you're prepared if the change occurs while you're still working on the project, or if you sealed it up beforehand, then we're not going to reopen sites. I think that there are maybe some rumors out there that we would be going out there and reopening sites. That's not the case. We have no intention of doing that. But we do want to make sure that sites that we're working on, and when the criteria changes, that we are protective to that level. There's also something else to consider is due care. Due care changes with the law, and due care is something that has to be looked at every day. If it was safe this way yesterday, is it safe this way today, based upon changes in the criteria? So that is something to take into consideration, are our due care rules. Jeannie will talk a little bit more about that in the next session, to give you some perspective on how due care works. So with that, are there any questions? Yeah.
I have a question. So since vapor intrusion is starting to be a big issue, when you're actually doing reductive chlorination for remediation, are you guys going to start kind of limiting that because of the production of PC and cis and powder products?
What we will, for in situ remedies, we will be looking to determine what those daughter products are, what the byproducts are, if they're vapors from that. And yeah, we will be asking that the remedy be protective of that. So you may see more requests for analysis for that, so that you can track it and see what you are producing, and contingencies if you do produce more of those. So yeah, we will be looking at them. I don't see that we won't be denying them. We won't say that you can't do it, but we will be asking that you take appropriate precautions if you are generating those, which is how we've been operating with the in situ remediation program since I've been part of it.
Yeah. What would be a typical source for
1,4-dioxane in drinking water, a typical source. Well, we have one of the largest sources, probably in the world, at the Paul Gelman site down in Ann Arbor. And it's a byproduct in making the filters that they made. And they disposed of their waste into lagoons. The lagoons, of course, leach down into the groundwater, and we have a significant issue there. We're also seeing it at a landfill site over in the Thumb area. So it's coming from there. And it's also a commonly found chemical when you have 1,1,1 TCA. So if you had a solvent like 1,1,1 TCA being used, you come up with 1,4-dioxane is also seen. And we have not been analyzing for that, so it's not something that you think about, but we're finding now that we have more knowledge about it that it does tend to be one of the chemicals with that compound.
That wouldn't be something your district health department would require you to test for unless it was really legal or something.
Right, yeah. The health department wouldn't require that. Health department does not require sampling for any of our hazardous substances unless there's reason to believe that we have an issue. Otherwise, they look at your typical nitrates and things like that.
I heard a rumor.
You had a
I
rumor?
heard a rumor that they were improving some of the, I can't remember the particular thing or
Yes, that's what we call the Wicks Pool. And it extends, I think now almost 6 miles. And in a very prolific, nice sand aquifer. So fabulous transport mechanism in a nice sandy aquifer, and that extends down to somewhere around 300 feet or so. So to have something that large to try to clean that up, again, that goes back to why we look at risk and trying to prevent people from being exposed as opposed to that. It would take a tremendous amount of money. Technology is there, but it would take a tremendous amount of money to do so.
We'll have houses on top of that?
Yep. And fortunately, the contamination is deep enough that I don't think vapor is an issue. But drinking water is an issue, so people are supplied with drinking water. Yeah.
Just to verify, so the new package might come in April, but after that, we'll move to public hearing, the committee, and all that. So it could be possibly months later when it's actually implemented as a law.
It could be, yes, yeah. The question was if the package is available in April. We do have all those processes that we are required to follow, so it could be months later, probably in the summer. But we are committed to getting those out there. Any other questions? No? Any rumors?
Somebody saw the Kardashians up by there.
Oh, yes. They're far more entertaining, aren't they? Cleanup criteria at 9 a.m. Again, we just stress, call us, talk to us. We try to help you. I can't give you a firm date on things, which I wish I could. But we're going to keep plugging forward and watch our listservs because we'll make announcements and when those things come out. Thank you.